Hi, everybody. This lecture is on logic, propositions, and arguments. So some of the things that we're going to be looking at in this lecture is what makes up arguments, these things, propositions, statements that have a truth value. We'll also be looking at argument types, types of logic that we use, as well as really what is an argument and the purpose of an argument. So beginning with propositions, right, before we really start to understand arguments, and remember, arguments are not those bickering back and forth things that we typically think of when we think of arguments. They're more of assertions that we make about the world and then justify those assertions. And so we basically make a claim and then we justify that claim. And when we do that, we're presenting an argument. And we do this all the time, whether it's expressing how we should conduct business, who to vote for, whether or not we should uh, let our parents or children borrow the car. Um, any of these things are essentially arguments. And so when we talk about arguments, we first have to get to know what propositions are because propositions make up arguments. And a proposition is a statement that we make that has a truth value assigned to it. So it's any statement that can be true or it can be false. Now, it doesn't matter if it's always true or if it's always false. It doesn't matter if it can sometimes be true or it can sometimes be false. It's just any statement that is true or false. And so statements like the lights are on in my room is a proposition because it could be true that the lights are on, but it could also be false that the lights are on. So, because it can be true or it is a proposition. Now, not all assertions are propositions. There are some assertions that we make that are not propositions, certain types of statements, rather. Questions are not propositions. Exclamations are not propositions. Orders, if you were to give an order, that would not be a proposition. And the reason those are not propositions is because there's no real truth value to them. When you ask a question, the question itself is not true or false. It's a question. It's not telling you something about the world, it's inquiring about the world. And so if it doesn't have that truth value, then we can't determine whether or not the parts of the argument are true or false. And if we can't evaluate the parts of the argument, then we can't evaluate the argument as a whole. And so here are some examples of statements, some of which are propositions, some of which are not propositions. So looking at the first statement, this is a proposition. Chocolate makes you fat. Now, it could be true that chocolate makes you fat, or it could be false that chocolate makes you fat. Either way, it's a statement that I'm asserting about the world, and it could either be true or false. Number two is also a proposition. I am giving a lecture. It could be true that I'm giving a lecture. It could be false that I'm giving a lecture. Maybe when you make the statement, I am giving a lecture, it's false, but when I make the statement, I am giving a lecture, it's true. Either way, there's this truth value that's associated with it, so we can evaluate the statement and whether or not the statement is in fact true or false. Now, distinguish that from this next statement, give me 20 push-ups. This is not a proposition because there is no truth value to this. Imagine being in the military or on a sports team and your coach or drill sergeant yells at you, give me 20 push-ups. It wouldn't make sense for you to look at that person and think, false. That wouldn't make sense because that's an order that's being given. The statement itself is not true or false. And so this is not a proposition. Similarly, number four is not a proposition either because it's a question. It's making an inquiry about the world. It's not making an assertion about the world. So when I say, does chocolate make you fat? I'm not telling you anything that's true or false. I'm asking you a question. Now, the answer to that question will be true or false. So if I say, does chocolate make you fat, which is not a proposition, but a question, and then you respond, yes, chocolate makes you fat, then you have just asserted a proposition because Now, you have suggested that, in fact, chocolate does make you fat, and you are asserting that that statement is true. So, propositions that have that truth value or statements that have that truth value are going to be propositions, and they're going to make up arguments. So when we start to understand arguments, when we start to think about expressing arguments of our own, it's important that when we do so, we're doing so in propositions, because otherwise it's difficult to evaluate what exactly is being said, and it won't really make sense when you try to justify a claim if the claim or the justification is not a proposition, because there just won't be a way to evaluate it properly. So we need to start thinking in terms of propositions, making clear, precise, simple statements that express a position about something. This is important when it comes time to writing papers as well. It's not just for a symbolic logic class or an introduction to logic class. When you think about writing a paper in any subject, typically when it comes to argumentative essays, your goal is to write a thesis statement, and that thesis statement is typically the answer to a question. And if it's the answer to a question, then it is an assertion, it is a proposition that requires justification. So if you use a thesis statement in a paper that you're writing, you are making a claim that you are trying to get the reader to believe. That way, when you start to justify that claim in your paper, by the time you're done, your reader should believe the thing that you asserted, namely that thesis statement. And so good persuasive essays are written in this fashion, where you make the assertion, you make this thesis claim, and then you defend that with other concrete propositions or assertions that are the justification, are the reasons and support for the thesis. Now, looking at number 5, chickens fly in the southern hemisphere. This is a proposition as well, even though the proposition is false. It doesn't matter if the proposition is true or false, only that it can be true or false. So if you read or listen to something or you make that assertion and think to yourself, well, that could be true, or it is true, or that could be false, or it is false, then it's a proposition. It's fair game to use when it comes to creating an argument. Continuing on, if I were to ask, can you really believe that? Again, not really a proposition because it's a question. You're not really making an assertion. You're more inquiring about something. And again, an inquiry doesn't have a truth or false value associated with it. Only the answer to a question has a true or false assertion to it, or a true or false value, rather. Similarly, if I were to just kind of think in my head, I wonder if I should take the 5 or the 805 to work. Here again, I'm not necessarily making a clear assertion. I'm not saying you should take the 5 to work, and here's why. Or I'm not saying you should avoid the 805 because of X, Y, and Z. Instead, I'm just kind of thinking about what I should do. And so my thought does not have a truth value associated with it. Number 8 is a proposition. Triangles have 3 sides. That's true. However, if I were to say triangles have 4 sides, which is clearly false, it would still be a proposition because it would still be a claim that's being made that has a false value. Now, if I were to just scream an exclamation, John, this is not going to be a proposition because, again, there is no true or false value. I can't shout out, John, and have someone turn around and think to themselves, true. This wouldn't really make any sense because I'm not saying anything about the world. I'm not saying anything that could be true or false. I'm just screaming out a name. Lastly, Texas is the largest state in the United States of America. Just like on the last slide, this is a false claim, but it is still a proposition because it is false. Anything that has that true or false value is a proposition. And we need to start to think in terms of propositions, because it's only when we think in terms of propositions can we determine whether or not those statements are true or false, which are going to help us determine whether or not the argument as a whole makes sense or it doesn't make sense. Because remember, when it comes to using logic and critical thinking, it's important for us to understand not only whether or not an argument makes sense, but whether or not the justification for certain assertions make sense and how justifications can help to support certain assertions. When we can better evaluate those things, we can determine whether or not what somebody says as a whole makes sense or doesn't make sense. So whether or not we should believe the things that are being said or not believe the things that are being said. It'll also help us in our own way to make arguments of our own to persuade people to do things. By making good arguments with true propositions and good structure and content, which we'll be talking about later, we will be creating these arguments that will be very persuasive. So when you think of propositions, you want to think of the conditions to which those statements being said or read are true, right? We want to know the truth condition of that particular statement. Now, one of the difficult things that often occurs when we talk about logic and critical thinking, when we talk about propositions, is that it can be the case that two statements have the same truth condition, but are said in different ways. So, for instance, looking at these two propositions, Mary is loved by John and John loves Mary. These propositions have the same truth value because the content, what is being said, is the same in both of these statements. Now, these statements are both written differently, right? One is written in the active, one is written in the passive. However, the content that is being expressed is the same. So when we're looking at arguments or when we're listening to arguments, it's really important to understand that just because something is said differently, it can still have the same truth condition. It can still mean the same thing, it's just said a little different. Take these two statements, for instance. These two statements, propositions, because they're making an assertion that is true or false, are the same even though they're written in different languages. Peter is clever and Peter ist klug, written in German, mean the same thing. The content is saying the same thing. So when one of these is true, the other has to be true. When one of these is false, the other has to be false, because they are expressing the same truth condition. So we want to make sure that when we're reading, when we're listening, that we're not necessarily nitpicking certain terminology. It's often a form of pseudo-listening or a form of non-listening to sit there and listen literally. So if someone were to say a series of words, if someone were to present a statement and then say that statement a little different later on, it doesn't necessarily mean that those things don't equal up. It doesn't mean that they're not saying the same thing. They can be saying the same thing if their truth condition is the same. And that truth condition is the meaning or the content behind what is actually being expressed. So it's important that when we're looking at propositions, we're looking at the truth conditions. We're looking at the meaning, the content within that certain proposition that's expressing a certain message. And we're taking messages with the same truth condition to be equal and taking messages with different truth conditions to be not equal. And so as we move on through this course, you'll notice that a lot of things are being expressed in different ways, but they can mean the same thing. And it's up to us to be able to interpret that information, which is very difficult to do. And this is part of the skill of being a good critical thinker, being open-minded, being flexible, someone who is empathetic, for instance. So when you listen, you are listening for intent, you are listening empathetically to try and understand what the person is trying to get across, rather than just literally listening, reading words and saying those words don't match up, so they must not mean the same thing. Well, they can if the truth condition is the same. Here again, we have another instance of that. If I were to tell you I am hungry, and I say it before lunch, and then tell you I was hungry after lunch, these two statements will be equal because they're expressing the same truth condition. Now take these propositions, for instance. The agony has abated and the pain has stopped. Technically, I have just provided analogies through Microsoft Word for the words pain and stopped, and I got agony and abated. Now, some of you may think that these don't have the same truth condition, while others might think that they do have the same truth condition. And you're both right. If the person expressing these propositions is being very loose and fast with their terminology, if they're just expressing a point and not really thinking too hard about the exact precise meaning of these words, then we should be able to get into that thinker or asserter's head and think, yeah, they're just using these words. I'm going to take them to mean the same thing because the person saying them is taking them to mean the same thing. If the person expressing these thoughts is specifically picking these particular words because it's important that these particular words are used rather than other words, then we have to get on that page and think very specifically and particularly about these words and their definitions. And so it's very difficult when it comes to really determining truth values. And this is why later in this course, we're going to see how we can take propositions and turn them into symbols and letters as representations so that we can kind of combine propositions that have the same truth value or same truth condition and separate out those that don't have the same truth condition. So it's important that when we're listening, when we're reading, that we're really trying to listen well to determine whether or not the truth conditions being used are similar or dissimilar to other truth conditions that are being expressed, other propositions that are being expressed in the conversation or reading. So when we think of propositions, think of it as the essence of a statement, right? It's the statement, it's the inherent meaning of what's being said or what's trying to be expressed. Now, when we look at arguments, arguments consist of these propositions. Typically for arguments, we have multiple premises and a conclusion. Now, a premise is just a reason to believe ultimately what your conclusion is. And so the premises of an argument are the support. So that when we look at arguments, typically when it comes to deductive arguments, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the premises infer the conclusion of the argument. So if we were to look at this argument here, all cats are clever, Jessica is a cat, Jessica is clever. We're making the ultimate assertion that Jessica is clever. This is our conclusion. This would be our thesis statement if we were to be writing an essay. This is the thing that I want you to believe. Now, the way I would get you to believe this is by offering justification, by offering premises to support that concluding claim. Now, my premises or support are other propositions that hopefully you take to be true, namely that all cats are clever and that Jessica is a cat. So that if you were to believe that all cats are clever and you were to believe that Jessica is a cat, you would be able to infer the conclusion that Jessica is clever. So looking at a proposition like this, San Diego State University is the best college in the world. Could this be an argument? And no, it really couldn't, because this is a proposition. This is just one simple proposition. It is making one claim and offering no justification. And without that justification, we're not really presenting an argument. So here we simply have a proposition. Now, if we were to add propositions to this, would we have an argument? San Diego State University is the best college in the world. Blue cheese tastes good. God does not exist. I am the walrus. Here we have multiple propositions, but still no argument because they're not structured in the right way. An argument requires one of its propositions to be supported or justified by the others. And here we just have four random propositions that don't really connect in any meaningful way. So we're not justifying any claim here, we're just saying four random things. So typically, when we think of arguments, we want to make sure that we're using two or more propositions. At the very least, we have one premise and one conclusion. Typically, we'll have more premises, but at the very least, you must have one premise and one conclusion. One thing being asserted and one piece of justification, minimum. So here again, Jessica is clever. How do I know that Jessica is clever? Well, because all cats are clever and Jessica is a cat. Now here we only have one premise, but this is an acceptable argument because again, we have the required material, the conclusion, the justification. I am trying to conclude and trying to get you to believe that John is not sad. What is my justification for getting you to believe that John is not sad? Well, that John is happy. And so if John is happy, obviously John is not sad. Now, this isn't necessarily a great argument, but it is an argument nonetheless. Now, in addition to just one piece of justification or two pieces of justification, an argument can have three pieces of justification. There can be three premises and a conclusion. There can be four premises, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 premises and a conclusion. Just as long as there's one premise and one conclusion, we have an argument. Now, another important aspect of the class is going to be seeing arguments written in standard form. This term, standard form, is going to be used a lot throughout this course. And what it is just an argument written in a very specific type of way. It's written in bullet format where the bottommost bullet is the conclusion and all the bullets above are justification, are premises. So here, my conclusion is that bad people will continue to get guns and hurt people. What is my justification for that? My justification is that if gun laws in this country are too lax, bad people will continue to get guns and hurt people. Gun laws in this country are far too lax. Therefore, bad people will continue to get guns and hurt people. Here I have two pieces of justification and one conclusion, written in standard form. Bullet point form, conclusion on the bottom, justification above. Now, when we're looking at arguments, it's important that those premises or justification are taken for granted, which means that your premises or justification need to be accepted, commonly accepted true statements that your listener or that your reader agrees with. Because if they don't agree with your justification, then why would they agree with your ultimate conclusion? We want the listener or the reader to approve of the justification, which will then lead to the ultimate conclusion. You can argue or you can have a controversial premise if you like, but if you do, you must then provide even further justification for that particular premise. So when we're writing or when we're expressing an argument, we want our reasons to be as true and commonly acceptable as possible. Take, for instance, this argument. Ultimately, I want to convince you that Trump's travel ban can't be enforced. Now, obviously, this happened a few years back. President Trump enforced a travel ban or created a travel ban, signed a travel ban into law, and it was argued that it can't be enforced. And the justification for it not being able to be enforced was that it was unconstitutional. And if it's unconstitutional, it can't be enforced. So here we have our premises, our justification for our ultimate conclusion. Now, one may think, however, and this was argued by opponents of this argument, that Trump's travel ban was not unconstitutional. In fact, it was constitutional. And so the person expressing this argument, because premise one is somewhat controversial, they must now defend premise one, which means they need further premises on top of premise one, and then premise one becomes somewhat of a sub-conclusion. And it's not until we can prove that sub-conclusion that we can finally get to premise two and get to our ultimate conclusion. So when we provide further premises on top of the controversial one, we get something that looks like this. Something is unconstitutional if the court deems it so, and the court deems Trump's travel ban as unconstitutional. Now, if you remember back then, I believe it was a court in Hawaii that deemed this travel ban as unconstitutional. So, with the first premise one and premise two, we can see that conclusion one would be true. And then with conclusion one and premise two, we can see that the ultimate conclusion would be true. However, even with this, we can still express some sort of counter-argument by suggesting, yeah, but the first premise two itself is not true. While the court in Hawaii, the appeals court in Hawaii, suggested that this was unconstitutional, eventually when this made it all the way up to the Supreme Court said it was constitutional. So we can see that in order for us to ultimately believe a conclusion, we need to have good justification, good true premises. And those premises must be accepted by the person that's reading or listening. Otherwise, we can't ever make it to a conclusion. Now, there are different types of logic that express arguments in different ways. We're going to focus in this class primarily on deductive and inductive arguments. We're not really going to talk about abductive so much. However, it is an important type of logic that we should know because we do use it often. So deductive logic is perhaps the most fundamental and best form of logic. And I say the best because it's the most certain. This is the ultimate logical claim to make because it is guaranteed. We are arguing for the certainty of a conclusion. So here, I'm trying to get you to believe that I, your teacher, is mortal. How can I get you to believe that? Well, I could justify that with the claim that all humans are mortal. And again, remember, I'm trying to use premises that are commonly accepted, premises that are commonsensical. I get you to believe that all humans are mortal. If you were to accept that premise, then I would then express another premise. I, myself, your teacher, am human. If I'm human and all humans are mortal, then it must follow deductively, certainly, that I am mortal. And so here, based on the premises, I am guaranteeing the conclusion, so that if you were to accept the premises, you would be guaranteed the conclusion. There would be no way for you to counter that position if you were to accept the premises. So again, deductive arguments are the goal. They are arguing for the certainty of something. And that's ultimately what we want. However, that's not always possible. And deductive arguments are rather difficult to create. This is why we have so much trouble and so much divisiveness when it comes to a lot of topics like religion or politics, abortion, capital punishment, climate change, right? All of these different topics that we seem to disagree about, we disagree about them because there aren't very good deductive arguments for them. Because if there were good deductive arguments, then we would be guaranteed a truthful conclusion. And it's not really the case that we could get there, because just like with an argument like this, you would have to be silly to not accept this as being true, right? This is a good argument, an argument that makes plenty of sense, and an argument where the premises are inherent. They are commonsensical, they are commonly accepted. And so we don't really we wouldn't really disagree about something like this because it's just kind of obviously true. This is what happens when you have good deductive arguments. There really isn't an argument. There really isn't a kind of back and forth. It's more of, yeah, of course that's the case, right? So if I were to express an argument with the conclusion the Earth revolves around the sun, nobody in their right mind, no sane person would really try and argue against that. Most people that you told, oh, the Earth revolves around the sun, nowadays would think, yeah, of course, yeah, because the argument is deductively true. Now, if I were to make an argument that didn't have that solid a foundation, solid justification, then we would start to see disagreements because the justification would be disagreed upon, just like with the previous argument. Now, sometimes, because we're not always certain about our propositions, instead of using deductive arguments, we use inductive arguments. And inductive arguments are arguments that are based on probability and statistics. So here we're not necessarily arguing for the certainty of something. Instead, we're simply arguing for the probability of something. We're hedging our bets, as it were, and thinking, well, this is likely to be the case. This is probably the case statistically. However, there is room for incorrectness. So here, I might make the argument that Socrates has a beard. What's my justification? Well, most Greeks have beards, and Socrates is a Greek. So assuming that most Greeks do have beards, let's say 75% of Greeks have beards, and then we say that Socrates is Greek, Socrates then has a 75% chance of having a beard, so I can feel confident and comfortable saying Socrates has a beard, probably, right? I'm making a claim, but there's still room for that claim to be false because it's based on statistics and probability rather than deductive certainty. So these are the types of arguments we often make when we're not quite sure whether or not something is the case, but instead just think that it's probably likely, and so we express an inductive argument. Again, we're going to be talking about this type of argument later on in the class. Lastly is abductive arguments. And abductive arguments, even though we're not going to be talking about them much in this class, offer a likely story for how things are. So here, I'm trying to express that the defendant is probably guilty. Why do I believe that the defendant is probably guilty? Well, because the defendant stutters and seems to get confused easily, and the defendant doesn't make eye contact with the accuser. So essentially what's happening here with the justification is that it's not statistically pointing to a conclusion, nor is it deductively guaranteeing your conclusion. But instead, it's sort of painting a picture to which we might think, that doesn't seem right for the defendant to be innocent, and so it just seems like he's kind of guilty. This is the type of logic used by doctors. When you go into a doctor's office, they don't know what's wrong with you. They're not certain what's wrong with you, nor do they know statistically what's wrong with you. Instead, they take all the information that they can get, essentially trying to paint a picture of your health, and from that picture, making an educated guess as to what's wrong. Now, they're very good at making these educated guesses, but we can see this happen. When we go into a doctor's office, we often give them our age, our weight, whether or not we drink or smoke, or how often we exercise. All of these things, they take blood pressure, they take temperature. They're trying to get and dig up as much information as they can so that when you go in with a stomach ache, they can think to themselves, well, based on your health, based on prior conditions, we think that this is the problem. So doctors might give you a medication or tell you to do something. You might go home and take that medication and it doesn't work. Now, if it doesn't work, then you go back, doctors are able to cross that off the list and then go to perhaps the next most likely story. And so the more information that they can get, the better the guess can be as to what is wrong with you. We also see this with kind of crime scene investigators, right? The more information, the more clues that a crime scene investigator can get, the more they can paint a picture as to what happened at the crime and point to the perpetrator of that crime. So with abductive arguments, we're essentially just trying to get all the information we can that paints a picture for us to tell a likely story. Again, not as certain as a deductive argument or as probable as an inductive argument, but still a way for us to kind of critically analyze and reason what's going on.